takashaka chujugi kunru keche da an tandabatu ji pumi dizulia ji shaza da gyapyo chinge chepsi thoni ne re benjo thoni ne re su de wa phebe ine konzulia chedu phuya da ninga jomo ne ji gadin cheshi ne tujile su shue koopchi dushin langyu an tidan nyamdo an kransu mo ne ya ji leje solia simshu phaya gi kransu bide misinaolia pedenge ledun chejo dan dewe thone ani galup songshe naya da tidegi koopchi dushin lengyu kazani Richard de pair to den kedu samba ani chikti tanga so leje solia galup chinalo naschi to shui ta prangi nge tamshe lo de ta mangbu chede ore chungwa ina testi roleng number lo chung tuwa ina yabudu shin sumudu de samba kazan kong garung yune tanga su su chungjina solia ani leje na lo ne Richard la ya chendi shugo ya taw de yoba ina ani number su Tibetaya ki kogop dushin pyuanyi an ti membe ina ngini geje gi modo she nge Tibetang ani di Quran lengya she an number su ngone ya Tibet le yoba ina ani para na sabki shin dushin pyuanyi before Richard speaks briefly an opening statement we want to honor you for your lifelong service for the cause of Tibet and the Tibetan people. Your contribution has been immense, not only as an individual, but as a film star. You have a large following all around the world, and your commitment to the Tibetan cause has also made you to take up the role of the president of the International Campaign for Tibet, under which you have undertaken a lot of initiatives, not only at the Hill, but also at many other platforms. So I won't go into details of what you did for us so far, because we will be having this discussion, and I'm sure, just like me, all the civil servants here would also like to know how you got involved. So those things will follow. We will go a little more into details of what Richard has done for us over the years. So without going more into the details of what you have already done for Tibet, we just want to honor you by offering you a thanka on the behalf of the Central Tibetan Administration and all the civil servants who are gathered here.
Thank you.
Shadant Yuve. Shadant. Kongadung. Oh, didn't know.
Could you check? Okay. I think this is appropriate, by the way, to have a tanka of the boss.
So I'll request now Richard to make an opening statement, and then we'll have a discussion.
Yeah, I'm always leery of these honors about a lifetime, because I'm not finished yet. I have a ways to go.
No, I never said it's a lifetime honor to you. It's an honor for all the things that you have done so far. Maybe we'll have bigger honors.
Yeah, there'll be much more later.
Yeah, in the years to come.
First of all, it's a great honor for me to be here. I never take this lightly. I'm very happy to be here with Pempala, who I've known a long time, in many different ways, in different incarnations, both of us actually. We were very delighted to have him in Washington, the Office of Tibet, for several years. And he has these extraordinary qualities of knowing his stuff. He knows what he's talking about. And he's also quite humble, which is really important in this kind of work. We don't have money on our side. We don't have normal exoteric Western power. What we have is truth. We have our hearts. We have our commitment. And as we interact in the world, that's really what touches people. Us just being deeply human, deeply understanding. We're good listeners. Pempa has these qualities, and I've seen him in action now with very, very important people in the American administration, and he always handles himself so beautifully and represents not only Tibetan government in exile, but the Tibetan culture, of one that it is wise and it's humble and it's deeply nonviolent. And understands that's the beauty of where you're all coming from. That genuine human quality, which touched me when I first met Tibetans. I remember, I'm going to be a little all over the place, but that's okay. I was just remembering being in Dharamsala. First time was 40 years ago, and most of you weren't even born yet. The first time I was here. I'm looking out here, I said, most everyone seems like they're under 25, maybe 30 years old, which is great, because your future of your culture is you guys right here. So 40 years ago, it was during monsoon, and it was extremely wet. I'd never seen a monsoon like this before. And there was nobody here then. It was before Nobel Peace Prize, and that next level hadn't happened yet. And I was staying at the Bagsu Hotel, and I think I was the only one there, and there was no hot water. Sometimes there was no water at all, and there was moss growing on the walls, and it was a very unpleasant experience. Fortunately, I had a letter to Nari Rinpoche of introduction, and he allowed me to stay at Kashmir Cottage, which is where I'm still staying right now, with my 22-year-old son, who's coming here for the first time, 40 years after I did for the first time. But I remember when I became aware politically of what was going on in the Tibetan world, and we were seeing the new arrivals, and the huge difference between the Tibetans in exile and these new arrivals who had lived. I mean, at that point in the 80s, it was 20 years, 30 years of living under the Chinese. They were different. And I know there was an enormous amount of energy in the local Tibetan community to smooth out the feathers of the Tibetans who had recently escaped and found their way to Dharamsala. There's something so extraordinary of who you are innately. Sometimes you have to be told this because you forget. You're very special. Very, very, very special. You have such a contribution ahead of you. You've given it already, but to the rest of the world, this is something precious that you guys had. And you hid it away for 1,000 years. And since 1959, your tragedy has been the rest of the world's joy to receive this precious jewel of who you are. That's a huge responsibility, I know. But it's something that I think you really have to continually remind yourselves that this is a precious, precious thing that is innate in you as a culture and as a people. It's what touched me, continues to touch me. When His Holiness goes around the world, it's what touches everyone. So this is something really special. This is something that we all want. That quiet confidence, the joy. I always joke, you're kind of the Italians of Asia. The Italians to us are the ones who really have a sense of joy and life about them. A little crazy, which I think Tibetans are a little crazy, and that's good. But you're in a position right now of many of you starting your careers. I think if any of you heard what I said at His Holiness's birthday, I think we all have been lulled away into a sense of well-being because His Holiness has been so strong and so powerful that we've relied on Him, and He's always come through for us, for all of us. I think it's really important that we realize that He can't carry all of us. We have to carry Him at this point. So what do we have to do? We have to be the best we can possibly be as human beings so that we present our culture, and I say our, I want to include myself in this, our Buddhist culture, our Tibetan culture, the best way we possibly can. We have to be humble. We have to be as wise as we possibly can be. We have to be as generous as we possibly can be. We have to be as nonviolent and patient as we possibly can be. And at the same time, with enormous energy moving forward with plans, making things happen. The worst thing that could happen in the Tibetan community is that we get passive and soft. We have to keep an edge, all of us. We have to get better at what we do, more skillful. As human beings, you know, His Holiness is always reminding us. But whatever your job is here, become the best that there has ever been at doing that job. Create a culture of superior qualities here, of being whatever it is. You're diplomats, you're writers, you're working in a cultural sphere, you're working in intelligence, you're working in security, you're working in schools and infrastructure, whatever it may be that your job is. Do the work to become the very best that there is. Not just for yourself, but for your culture, but for yourself too. To inspire your kids, inspire your neighbors, inspire everyone else, everyone you meet. That they walk away from a meeting with you and think, these Tibetans are amazing. They are so good at what they do. This is not a refugee community who's looking for handouts. This is a refugee community that inspires people, that has ideas and visions of possibility, and has then the expertise, the skill to make things happen. And anyhow, that's how I see my job. I try to come at it that way. I know Pempa does, and I'm sure all of you do. And I only say this as an encouragement that we as a community have to keep working on this idea of excellence all the time with a lot of energy. We're not passive. Nonviolence is not passive. It's very powerful. It has enormous energy, a focused kind of energy. And we have to keep that going. So again, it's a great honor for me to be here and just even talk about things that have meaning to all of us. And when Pempala asked me to speak, I said, I really don't like giving speeches because it's energy coming in one direction. I like to hear from people too, and I'm not afraid of friction also. I think out of a genuine sense of ideas bouncing off each other, good things happen, better things happen. So I don't know if we're going to have a dialogue here or what Sikyong has planned for us.
Okay, Richard, you turned all of them below 20, 25?
I said 25 to 30. I see a few of you out there older than that, but you don't have to raise your hand.
And he went back 40 years of his relationship or his first visit to Dharamsala. That makes him look like 50, right? And we are not going to talk about his real age.
I'm 96. I look pretty good for 96, don't I?
Yeah, so let's go back a little more than that. Can you give us an idea as to who was the first Tibetan you met? We know that Radha Gyongla Rinpoche is your root guru. When did you meet him first? And how did you proactively become a campaigner for Tibet? Who influenced you?
The very first. This is quite a story. I don't
meeting with His Holiness.
I don't tell this story very often, but I'll tell it here. The very first Tibetan I met, I have to preface it by saying that my first experience with Buddhism, I was very taken with Zen Buddhism. So my earliest teachers were Japanese. And I was walking down the street one day in New York. And I was there with my girlfriend. And there was a church, Catholic church, and there was a sign outside that said, HH, and I'll tell you later who it was. But there was Tibetan something, and a Tibetan something was going on. And I walked in with my girlfriend, and I sat down, and it was Dujum Rinpoche, who was sitting on a throne in the Catholic Church, giving a wong on Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche. Now, I didn't know anything about this, because this wasn't my tradition, but I sat there, and I was initiated into Guru Rinpoche right off the street. So I'm sure there's some kind of a karma there that was expressing itself in causes and conditions. But Dujum Rinpoche was the first Tibetan I met, and in that moment was initiated. So pretty powerful. The second time that I met Tibetans was actually outside of Pokhara, and it was at the refugee camp there. And at that time, Pokhara it had one road. It was one dirt road that came through.
You remember which year you met with Dujum Rinpoche the first time?
It must have been late 70s, 78, something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I found myself in Pokhara in 79, maybe, and was on a trek. I just wanted to see the Himalayas and whatever, and I went for a walk. And I had a vague idea about the Tibetans. And I saw a sign for the refugee camp. I don't know what it was called then, but walked in there, and it was like walking into a completely other reality structure. There were a lot of old Tibetans there, a few young ones. Some of them spoke a little English, but it was just, it felt like I was in a completely different time, space, altered consciousness. These recent arrivals from Tibet, who had essentially been living in probably the 18th century before they came out, but were still carrying this thing, this deep Tibetan thing in them, and I was tremendously impressed. What I felt there wasn't an intellectual exercise, it was an emotional one. Then a few years later, 81, I think it was 81, maybe 82, but I think it was 81, I had decided I was going to go to Tibet. And I spoke to a friend of mine, John Avedon, who was quite involved with the Tibetan diaspora and the government in exile, and His Holiness had already done a book with His Holiness and had just written this book, In Exile from the Land of Snows. And so I was on my way to Tibet, and a mutual friend said, well, you should talk to John. And I talked to John, and he said, don't go to Tibet, go to Dharamsala. His Holiness is there. Most of the High Lamas who escaped are there. So I came here and had very little idea of what would happen while I was here. So as I said, in the monsoon, I ended up at Nari Rinpoche's, and I said, well, of course, I'd like to meet His Holiness. And I had some letters of introduction. And Nari Rinpoche and Rinchen Kandrla were very, very smart with me. They said, well, maybe in 10 days or so, maybe 2 weeks, we can get an audience for you. In the meantime, they showed me everything in the Tibetan community. All of the programs, the school, the parliament, the handicraft center, Tipa, blah, 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 everything to do with this. And I was up in the hills with Geshe Yeshe Dobden, who was a hermit up in the hills here. Spent time with him. So I had a quick immersion in Tibetan culture. And I think Nari Rinpoche thought I was ready to meet His Holiness, and I very nervously went up to have an audience with His Holiness. And I was laughing with my son about this, because we Westerners especially, but I think Tibetans also, you have this feeling when you meet His Holiness that He's just going to go, and you're enlightened. And so I had this this desire that it would happen, and this longing that it would happen. But His Holiness was very, very skillful with me. He didn't know who I was, and I was quite a well-known actor at that point in the West. And he was talking in Tibetan to Nari Rinpoche, basically saying, "Who is this guy?" And he said, "You know, this is an actor. He's pretty well known, and blah blah blah." So His Holiness looked at me for a while, and he said, "So my brother tells me you're an actor." And I'm thinking, this is the last thing I want to talk about, is acting. I want to talk about enlightenment. So I said, yes, Your Holiness, I'm an actor. And he said, "Well, when you do this acting thing," he said to me, "when you do this acting thing, and you're angry doing this acting, are you really angry? And when you're laughing, are you really laughing? You think it's funny? When you're crying, is it because you're really sad?" And I thought about it a second, and I gave a very actorish answer. I said, "Yeah, well, it's always better if you are really feeling it. And, you know, you really have some anger coming up, and you're angry, and you're really sad when everything. And you're really laughing because it's funny. You have to, you know, you're really doing it." And he looked at me like this for a while, and he just started laughing at me. And of course, I had to think about this for a long time. But it was so skillful of His Holiness of how to, one, break down this expectation that he was going to be a magician and fix all of your problems, and skillfully get past the concepts of how we set up our lives. Of course, what he was saying to me was, here I am, I'm the magician who makes these emotions. I'm able to make laughter and pain and suffering and jealousy and all these human emotions. I'm able to manufacture them. But I don't realize that in real life, I'm doing the same thing. We all are doing the same thing. We're manufacturing these emotions, these negative emotions, like we are our own magician. We just forgot that we're creating these emotions. There's nothing innate in us that is jealous or angry or filled with hatred or any of the other emotions. And it was such a skillful way of talking to me based on the life that I had set up for myself as an actor. So that was the beginning of my voyage into the center of the Tibetan world.
Which year was that when you met with His Holiness?
It was 81, I think it was.
81. But can you go back in time, talk a little bit about your relationship with Ratu Kyongla Rinpoche?
With?
Ratu Kyongla Rinpoche?
With Ratu Chungla, yeah. We do it the other way around.
Okay.
We do Chungla Ratu Rinpoche.
Chungla Ratu Rinpoche.
Yeah. I was on my way to Bodh Gaya a few years after that. Mm-hmm. And we stopped in Frankfurt. The way you used to get to India at that point was you really stopped. You took Lufthansa to Frankfurt, and then you got another flight from Frankfurt to Delhi. And so, but the friend that I was traveling with said, you know, we're meeting a Tibetan Lama there. I thought, oh, it's great, in Frankfurt. So we stopped there, and she came back on the plane, and she had this guy in blue jeans and a golf cap. And that was Chungla Ratu Rinpoche. And so we spent the next 3 weeks together in Bodh Gaya, by going to Nalanda and the Vulture's Peak and everything else in Bodh Gaya. And again, does everyone here know Chungla? Did they have experiences with him? I'm just curious.
No, they're all below 25. How will know? How will they know?
They wouldn't know.
Ratu Kyongla Rinpoche 투주 영수에 왜 찾잖아.
Very few.
Yeah. Very few. Yeah.
Well, he just passed away. He was 100 years old, 100, and he was functioning at a very high level right up to the last day. He was actually, when His Holiness went for his Geshe degree, Chungla Ratu Rinpoche was his partner, his debate partner. So he and His Holiness had been together for a very long time. Mm-hmm. So Chungla Ratu Rinpoche and I became very, very good friends, and we started to sponsor teachings of His Holiness in New York, and really were very involved together in making things happen. But Chungla Ratu Rinpoche was well, a world-class scholar. When we were together with His Holiness, he always, kind of in fake jealousy, said about Ling Rinpoche. Ling Rinpoche said, "You, Ratu Rinpoche, were the best student, not me." He said that over and over and over again. And Ling Rinpoche, in fact, they gave Ratu Rinpoche his mala when he passed. So really one of the highest lamas in the Gelugpa order. He wrote, with Dudjom Rinpoche, he wrote school books for the first schools when the diaspora, the refugees started coming out. And the very first schools, of course, they wrote these books that were way too intelligent and way too difficult for kids. But in fact, they're held as great relics now, these incredible books that Dudjom Rinpoche and Chungla Ratu Rinpoche wrote.
So can you tell us a little bit about how you really got into political activism for Tibet, and who influenced you?
It was His Holiness. His Holiness grabbed me and said, I remember it was in Bodh Gaya, you know, and I, of course, when you start to get involved with the Tibetans, you understand a bit of their history anyhow. And certainly you know their present situation as exiles and the present situation inside of Tibet. But I remember being in Bodh Gaya, and I was actually on the way to the train and leaving Bodh Gaya. And one of His Holiness's attendants came to me and said, His Holiness would like to see you. And I had met him briefly 2 times before that. The one time in Dharamsala, another time in Rikon, Switzerland, at the Kala Chakra there. In, when was that, 84, 85, 6, 86, yeah, I think it was. That time, yeah. And then, so anyhow, I was delighted and quite nervous, as we all are when we're going to see His Holiness. And so I came into his rooms on the 2nd floor of the Gompa there. And I remember him moving through the room. I was brought into the room, was told to sit down, and he came from the back room. And I don't know why I thought this, but he wasn't dressed like the Dalai Lama anymore. He felt like a young prince, as one would almost imagine the young Shakyamuni. He was a young prince moving through the space. And I remember the sun was coming through the windows in my eyes, and he went to the blinds and adjusted the blinds so it wasn't in my eyes. And we sat down and he talked for quite some time, but the gist of what he was saying to me is, we Tibetans, we need our friends in the West. We can't do this by ourselves. We need friends. And he said, will you be our friend?
Okay.
It's very emotional for me.
Yeah.
So I said, of course I'd be a friend. And I remember he took a coin, and a gold coin, he said, this is very precious. He said, this belonged to the 13th. And he put it in my hand, and he pushed it into my hand, and he closed my hand around the coin. And next thing I know, I was back outside of the big doors of the Gompa. And Chungla Ratu Rinpoche, who had brought me there, was waiting there. And he took me to a side room, and he could see that I was quite emotional about this experience. And I opened my hand, and there was a coin there, and he said, did His Holiness give it to you with his own hand? And I said, yes, no. Did he give it to you with his own hand into yours? And I said, yes. And he said, ah. And he went and he got some beautiful fabric. I remember this so clearly. And he opened the fabric, he took the coin and he put it in the fabric. And he spent maybe 10 minutes wrapping up this coin perfectly. Perfect. and beautiful. And then he gave it to me and said, "This is precious. You be careful with this." And of course, I still have that.
Can you talk about some of the milestones since you have taken, since you started campaigning for Tibet, being a strong advocate for Tibet, some of the achievements over the years that you like to highlight on?
Well, of course, at that time I was the co-chairman of Tibet House in New York. Bob Thurman and I started that in the late 80s. And by the time we did what I just kind of invented it. I said, we're going to do a year of Tibet. And then I said, we're going to make it the International Year of Tibet, 1991.
Yes.
And so we just did it. And everyone said it's impossible, but we did it anyway. So at that point, I felt like I wanted to become much more in the political side. And obviously I kept my teachers and my relationship with His Holiness as a student. And ICT had just started, I think maybe the year before that. So I came on as a board member, and within a few years I found myself as the chairman, and was working very closely with Lodi Gere Rinpoche, who became a very close friend and a mentor in many ways for me of how to navigate not just the Tibetan world, but the world of Washington. I mean, he was quite extraordinary in his abilities. Again, with no money, no real power, worldly power at all, but he was able to engage people at a very, very powerful emotional level about Tibet. And he was such a great representative of His Holiness. So they were an incredible duo together, and I think I brought my own energy to that as well. So we were able to achieve some extraordinary things there. The Tibet Policy Act of 2002 is a milestone, where policy became enshrined in law. The Tibet Policy Act is law in the US, and it created this position of special coordinator for Tibetan affairs, which again, another milestone. In the State Department in the US, there is a person, and it ended up being a quite high-level person. Their job, amongst other jobs they would have, would be as a special coordinator for Tibetan affairs. So that was a huge milestone. His Holiness getting the Congressional Medal was another huge milestone. The rotunda in the Capitol, which is one of the most sacred places in our democracy, was where His Holiness received that Congressional Gold Medal with people on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, who were hugely competitive and had almost a visceral dislike for each other. In that atmosphere became brothers and sisters. And the President of the United States and the heads of both parties were there. Of course, Speaker Pelosi was there, but she wasn't Speaker at that point. The joy and love and affection for His Holiness, but for the Tibetan cause, for the Tibetan people in general, became codified at that point, not just in law, but in the heart of Americans in quite an extraordinary way, and has made our work in Washington that much easier to do. I mean, Pempa's been aware of that. You felt that yourself. Right. And how we are welcomed in almost every office, top to bottom, in Washington, to discuss your lives and the lives of your brothers and sisters inside of Tibet. So I think those would be the major ones.
Would you like to talk a little bit about the Gere Foundation?
About the Gere Foundation?
The Gere Foundation,
well,
and what it does.
Yeah, I mean, basically the Gere Foundation is intended for the work of Tibet. And we do lots of things with human rights and education and health around the world. But primarily, I mean, it's funny, the executive director, Mali Rodriguez, I met her because of the AIDS work we were doing. And she was a principal in the Pediatric AIDS Foundation. And when I brought her into my organization, we had a good working rapport, but she didn't know anything about Tibet. Now, the only thing she will do is work on Tibet. So Tibet has completely taken over my foundation at this point. But also, we started Gere Foundation India Trust, where we were doing a lot of work in India as well. But we're just closing that now because I realized we didn't need it.
Yeah, other than Tibet, there are many roles that you play internationally, not just only on Tibet, but you also focused on AIDS and other issues. You want to talk
I
about
think it's really important. And I'm glad you bring that up, because I think there's a danger in having too tight of boundaries around the Tibetan cause. And the danger is we'll get marginalized if we just think about it as a tight, small niche. The whole thrust of what we are all doing is beyond Tibet. Of course we care about Tibet, and we care about what's going on to our Tibetan brothers and sisters inside. But I think what makes it special is it's the Bodhisattva vows that we've all taken. This is not just about Tibet. It's all beings in all universes, and that's why we have the power, without money, without influence, without economic gain for anyone. It's really the question of right and wrong, and this sense of universal responsibility, which His Holiness is articulating every moment of his life in every situation. So for me, to work on Tibet is the same as working on boat people in the Mediterranean, and working on HIV/AIDS, to working on people who are hungry everywhere, to working on other political situations where people don't have access to power and are suffering greatly. And I've always counseled, with Lodi we would have these arguments, but with everyone in the Tibetan cause. Anybody who needs the help, Tibetans should be there. That's our power, is that we care about everybody, even the bad guys we care about. I've seen that over and over again, how that genuine aspect of Tibetan culture, but also in all the Tibetan organizations and the Tibetan, whatever actions we take in any situation, if we're coming at that from a universal place, we have so much more power than just saying Tibet, Tibet, Tibet.
I'll open the floor for the civil servants to intervene whenever they wish to. You can raise your hand and I'll point it out to you. 지워당해요나 나머지 고급 표현이 개선에 저지들이 제일 중요해.
Yeah, don't be shy. This is always a difficult situation, but we're all friends here. It doesn't matter.
And maybe in that meantime, when they think about what question they want to ask, we covered the past. Now, do you want to cover the present situation of how U.S. sees Tibet in the evolving political developments, dynamism that is happening?
Yeah, I mean, we have to focus our energies, and we certainly, I forgot the name of the act. What was the last act we had about the equal access? What do we call it? Rata. So the
reciprocal access.
Reciprocal access. I forgot it for a second, but this is an interesting thing. We can't reach too high. We have to be speaking very high all the time, but we have to be realistic of what we can achieve moment to moment. And the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, Rata, was something we felt we could achieve. This was international norms of diplomatic behavior. The fact that people are not allowed to come into Tibet, diplomats, even I can't go to Tibet, I can't go to China. It's more difficult to get into for someone who we want to get there, a journalist, a human rights activist, rapporteur from the UN, more difficult to get into Tibet than in North Korea. This is well known. So this act said that if we can't get into Tibet, then the Chinese who are behind that policy cannot get into the US. And that was passed actually almost unanimously. And it's one without real strong teeth, but it's something that freaked out the Chinese completely, which, you know, from time to time, it's good to rattle the chain of the Chinese. It's okay. Oh, well, I was saying, yeah, go ahead.
Please. Mike, do it.
Oh, Tishle Richard La.
Actually,
I want to take this opportunity and appreciate your efforts, your time, your commitments, your risk and sacrifices that you have made for us. Sincerely, thank you for that. It's not a question per se, just a thought that I've been having for many years, and a few of them have, come up again during your talk on the birthday celebration the other day, where you mentioned that His Holiness will one day eventually leave his body.
yes.
And he's been carrying that weight for so long. I also recollect one time His Holiness said it during one of his talks. I don't know the exact words, but the message that I got was that he's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and we eventually have to do some on our own.
Yeah.
And the other context that I want to give here is that I saw a cartoon where on a cart there were Tibetan monks and lay people praying, and the cart was being pulled by His Holiness. And His Holiness also said that, if you only pray, you don't get things done. You go action, make actions, right? I'm sorry. The other point that I want to connect here is a Westerner told me once that if someone comes to your house and kicks you out, you will take a temporary residence at someone's place as a guest. But how long will you live in that as a guest in that person's house? Where is that urgency that is dying down in the Tibetan community? Like you said, we shouldn't be soft. We've got to build our skills. So my thought here today is that I think we are getting soft. Do you see that change when you, 40 years ago, came into the community, and right now you're still in the community? Do you see a change there? Are we moving to the better? And what sort of a mentality do we prepare for the future, where we got to do our own carrying, especially for CTA staff? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there's a sense of, we're talking amongst ourselves. I wouldn't say this outside of the room. But yeah, I do think.
It's going live.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right, then I won't say it. I think there's a tendency, yes, to settle in. When I came here 40 years ago, or even 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, people still were not building with concrete. You weren't planning to stay here.
They didn't have much money at that time.
But it was still, when are we going back? Is it going to be this year we're going back? Maybe next year. I think there's a little sense that maybe we're here. And, in terms of creating institutions, like your schools, like your healthcare, like these institutions, I think it's probably good to have solid institutions that have a basis, a real basis, and planned out and done well. And what you learn in the process, when you do go back to Tibet, you can help there, having learned how to do it well. But I do think that there is probably a sense of fatalism that has creeped into the Tibetan community, which is not particularly healthy. I think you can, in the relative world, we can live well. We're here now. We want to live well here. But we don't forget, really the work here is to help the brothers and sisters in Tibet. Even if we don't go back right away, we got to be helping them in any way that we can. And these are the hands and feet and bodies that are going to do it right here. So this sense of urgency, this sense of not expecting someone else is going to carry the load. This sense of active responsibility, which I have no problem with having really strong emotional discussions within this community, whether it's Ranzen or it's middle way. These are good things to have. This community should get their blood up about these things and really worry about them and really think about them and have real discussions and friction about it. It's good. That's good for society. It's good for democracy. Democracy has to be bloody in a way. You've got to put yourself out there with your beliefs. When people question each other, they get better. When people just bow to each other all the time, things get too soft. So maybe we bow and get back to the argument right away. That's okay. But a vital community, a vital democratic community, the revolution is perpetual. It never settles. We're in a very dark time in the US right now. Politically, I'm not happy with what's going on. But I think it has released some demons, some latent dark energy is being released, and we're dealing with it. And maybe that's a positive thing. It's being released. We have to deal with it. It's not being pressurized inside the system. But I do think there's a... Look, you're all very kind Buddhists, and you do your best to be the best Bodhisattva Buddhist you can possibly be. But at the same time, the visions, the creative visions of possibility is something you have to work very hard to achieve. So keep the visions coming and keep learning the skills of how to achieve those. The same way that you can achieve, the mandala of whatever deity you're practicing. It's a creative process. It's not a passive one.
Kazane tadi chero she shuinda kundu che parjaya gudeyo soroshtida. Okay, dipara chiwadanga yunu chadi narona. Maybe we can talk a little bit. Okay,
sure, we have
please.
one here.
Yeah.
A very brave woman right here.
Okay.
It's all right. You can speak very loud.
Yeah.
First of all, Tashidile,
Tashidile.
and welcome to Dharamsala and CTA.
Thank you.
So I would like to ask whether you've been to Tibet, and if yes, then what are the hardships that Tibetans are facing in Tibet? And if not, if you have any plans to visit Tibet. First thing. And the second thing is, what are the differences that you see the Tibetans in abroad and Tibetans in exile? And what advice would you give for both of the Tibetans?
All the Tibetans are you're talking about all the Tibetans in exile, those who are in India, Nepal, and Bhutan?
Yes.
And the rest of the world. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, there's no way I can go to Tibet. I mean, I was allowed this is a long story,
Please.
but I'm not going to tell the long story.
We have little time here.
We do have a little time?
We have time.
This is a
There are
3-hour
less
story.
questions.
So anyhow, the time, I don't know if in fact, you're all too young, but there was an Academy Award year that I spoke about Tibet. And
First, you talk about what prompted you to speak at that occasion.
Well, I felt I really care. I'm not pretending. I care about this. And I also realized that this was the first year that the Academy Awards was going to be seen in China, live. So I felt it was an opportunity, but also a responsibility. So I spoke about Tibet, and I wasn't condemning anyone, but I just highlighted what was going on with Tibetans, and I sincerely believe that if the Chinese really knew what they had done, what the Communist Party was doing in Tibet, they would be appalled. I remember, I'm digressing here a little bit, but I remember there was a documentary on public television in the US. I think it was Fire Over Lhasa, I think it was called. And it was after the riots in '88. And there was film footage there of Chinese police beating up monks, and there was an interview within this documentary of the ambassador, I think it was the ambassador from China to the US. And he was saying, well, no, we behave so well with Tibetans, and we're helping them develop, they're very backward, and we were able to bring them into the 20th century, the 21st century, and we've spent a lot of money, and no, what you hear about what we've done there is not true. And then the filmmaker showed him the footage, and he sat forward, and he looked at this footage that I'm sure you've all seen, and he started crying. He didn't know. He just didn't know. In a way, it's like the Russians now. The Russian people don't know what's happening in Ukraine. They've been so brainwashed and so cleansed of any other possibility, any other information. So I still go under the very strong impression if the Chinese were able to know what was happening and actually spend time with Tibetans, that their hearts would open and the situation could change radically. But you also have to understand the Chinese people are also being abused right now. And they've been abused for many, many, many decades as well. They live in this surveillance state where they have no privacy. In any event, the question, what's another part of your question? I forgot.
The other question is about, do you find differences between Tibetans who live in the Western countries?
Yeah, but let me go back a bit. And I've been talking to the Collins about this as well, and Sekyong and I have talked about this. We're getting so little information coming out of Tibet right now. I used to go to the reception camps in Nepal, and I was getting this fresh information all the time with newcomers coming through. And it was always bad news, but we were getting fresh information of what was going on. That has stopped. There's only a handful of Tibetans are getting out now. And the direct communication, I remember in Kirti Monastery, they would call up from here to Kirti inside of Tibet, and they'd have conversations over the cell phone. All of that, as you know, is finished now. So I think we have to upgrade, the ability to get good intelligence, timely intelligence. Who's the Tibetan rock star who self-immolated? Well, it was weeks before we heard about this. Remember, the previous immolations, we had almost live footage of the immolations. It was 3 or 4 weeks before we even heard what had happened. So we're in a very difficult situation now of really knowing what's going on in Tibet. We have to spend energy to upgrade our intelligence. And I think creating partnerships with Western countries and frankly with the Indians of getting real-time, current, hard information is something we really have to work on. In terms of Tibetans here, you essentially the Indian Tibetans and the Toronto and American Tibetans. Yeah, there is a difference. I think there's the kids that have grown up in Toronto and New York and in Zurich and elsewhere are different than the kids that grew up in the settlements here. They have a Western sense of expectation of things, of what democracy is, of their place in the community, of a certain material level of expectation, very different than the Indian and Bhutanese and Ladakhi and Nepalese Tibetans. And I think that's probably a shame. I think the communities in the West are doing their best to keep the communities together and the sense of being Tibetan, being alive. I don't think that material wealth or being accustomed to other cultures is necessarily a bad thing to retain the Tibetanness. But I think it's something culturally that you do have to find a way that your communities communicate with each other and are involved with each other. I think these communities can learn from each other. You know, in a way, I think maybe Indian Tibetans are kind of stuck in a self-image of who they are as a refugee community. I think the Toronto and American and the Zurich Tibetans don't think of themselves as refugees. I think they might have more possibilities in their sense of vision. They're not locked into that. So I think the communities can speak to each other well and learn from each other.
Please. 견조 네 카바킹인데 배가 입대고 오면 너.
Tashile.
The question seems it's a bit common, but my question is why do you think the Chinese government is not coming to the negotiating table? And perhaps the answers are very obvious, but maybe it's because of the preconditions they set. Or
Because what?
Preconditions
Yeah.
of the history. I mean, why do you think, from the Chinese perspective, they are not coming to the table? Why they are not coming to the table? And with your history of work as a Westerner, I think the answer is a bit obvious, but still I would like to know.
Yeah.
Okay, let's seek his perspective. If the answer is obvious, then you should be answering it yourself. Sorry, please.
My answer would be, there are many things that come to my mind, but I'm not sure why.
Well,
because
Go ahead.
The whole primary goal is to make them come to, but we are not able to. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying we're not trying, but I mean, from their perspective, maybe are they thinking that we are too small to be ignored or something like that? Thank you.
I mean, these are obviously the things we think about all the time. Look, I wasn't directly involved with any of the meetings. And Richard Gere was an excellent negotiator. You know, I heard it said often with ambassadors and people from around the world that they considered Lodi would be a top person in any government. He was that good and he was that skilled. And Lodi obviously tried very hard in these meetings to make some kind of progress. And obviously when you're dealing with someone like this, an adversary, you want them, the way to break down is to make them feel unthreatened. So the Tibetan approach was never making accusations, but it also wasn't pre-negotiating anything, which I think was wise. It was to be at the negotiation table that these discussions would happen. So preconditions, and the most difficult one, of course, was saying that Tibet had always been a part of China was insane. You know, everyone knows it's not true. Even Chinese scholars know that's not true. China was not China, always. China is fairly recent, the idea of China. And Han China, very recent. We've been talking about this a lot in Washington and in our ICT offices in Berlin and Amsterdam and Brussels. And I think the key to this is that legitimacy. It's all about legitimacy. That China will never really have control of Tibet unless it's legitimized in some way. If it's done through war, occupation, intimidation, there never will be that legitimacy. And the only one who can give them legitimacy is His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The only one. So it's quite insane that if that's what you're looking for, legitimacy and the security that goes along with genuine legitimacy, why would you alienate the one person who can be trusted? His Holiness has proven himself over and over again in his many years, a man who can be trusted, a man who does not lie. Why would you alienate him? Well, it goes to the point is that the legitimacy is so insecure, that issue is so insecure for the Chinese, they can't go near it. So I think this is the weak point that we have to exploit with them. And the history is part of that. The correct history, not, since they say, since antiquity, Tibet has been a part of China. Well, since antiquity, Tibet wasn't even Tibet. Asia was moving, in terms of dynasties, all over the place for thousands and thousands of years. China didn't exist as it does today. And there certainly were times when the powers in Tibet controlled almost all of Asia, including what is now China. So the gloss of history, the gloss of a false narrative that the Chinese have been dominating the world with has to be countered. And you do that by, we had hearings in Congress a few weeks ago, just before I came here, and in which Western scholars and a scholar from Hong Kong laid out the correct history, the legitimate history, the authentic narrative of Asia and specifically Tibet and China. So I think this is something that we need to work on. And the idea that since ancient times Tibet has been part of China is, we have to counter that all the time. We now have a bill that's making its way through Congress that is exactly saying that, is that we have something on the books, it's called the sense of the Congress. It's not a law, but it's the sense of the Congress that Tibet is an occupied country. Now, there's nothing in our law that states that it is an occupied country, but it's a sense of the Congress. There's a sense, an emotional sense that that is the truth. We're trying to have a law now that states Tibet, the status of Tibet has not been clarified, and it's only through negotiations between the Tibetans and the Chinese that would be clarified, at which point whatever the Tibetans and the Chinese work out, that will be the status of Tibet. But there is no clarified status at this point. So it's very important for us all to say that's still an open question. Not independence, it just has to be clarified. And if it's the middle path, fine. That's negotiated between the interested parties. So we're working very hard to codify that in Washington so that it can be brought to parliaments, congresses, legislatures all over the world. That everyone is coming from that same point of view. It's not resolved yet, the question of Tibet. It's not resolved. And the only way it can be resolved is through a face-to-face negotiation. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, the 16th cabinet has changed its strategy in terms of how to gain leverage for the middle way approach. And Richard Gere always has been very kind to spend his time with us, even when I was the representative in Washington, D.C. When we go lobby, Richard Gere used to come up and we used to go together. And now after I assumed the responsibility of the Sikong, this year in April, we went together and we really worked hard to get things done. And in 2 months' time, we did manage to organize the World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet, of course organized by the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, but we do render all the support system to logistic and other support system that the Parliament needs. But alongside the Parliament session, we organized for the first time the hearing that Richard Gere just mentioned, participated by experts like Michael Van Wall Prague, whose arguments are based on his latest book called Tibet Brief 2020. And then Professor Lau Hanxiang, he made a larger presentation at the World Parliamentarians Convention talking about historical Tibet from a Qing dynasty perspective and Ming dynasty perspective, where he conclusively proves that the Mings, neither the Mings nor the Qings have ever considered Tibet as part of China. So that is what Richard was talking about, the weak point of China, the weakness of China. Where we need to strike is the legitimacy of China over Tibet. And the only people who can give legitimacy to China over Tibet is His Holiness Dalai Lama or the Tibetan people. That's why now we start asking this question, or we start telling governments as to why do you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC. One, you're going against international law, because the only one agreement that we have with the Chinese government or the PRC is a 17-point agreement that was signed after the forceful occupation of Chamdo. And under international law, no agreement post-forceful invasion can be considered legal. So that is one argument that we try to make. And the other argument that we try to make is when you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC, you are kowtowing to the Chinese government on the one hand, and then you are also telling the Chinese government that you do whatever you want in Tibet, we will not interfere. Just like what's happening in Ukraine today, the whole world is watching and people are getting killed. So then on the other hand, countries say that they support negotiation between the envoys of His Holiness or the Central Tibetan Administration and the Chinese government. And we tell them these are contradictory. It doesn't help because China rules Tibet, inside Tibet, with an iron hand, and then you get this assurance from the international community. But the question really is, why does China ask every nation to repeat this statement that Tibet is part of PRC? Because China knows that they don't have legitimacy, and that is where we need to strike. And that is the reason why we keep talking about the historical independent status of Tibet, which not just the Tibetans are talking about, but now you have a Westerner talking about, you have a Chinese talking about it. So based on those arguments, which does not go against the stated position of His Holiness that I'm not a historian and let's leave history to historians. So our position now does not go against the stated policy or the position of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but at the same time try to put pressure on the Chinese government, questioning the historical legitimacy of China over Tibet and the independent status of Tibet, not mentioned only by the Tibetans, but others. So we hope that this will bring some traction, and then we'll have to keep revisiting this, because the efforts that we have made so far is only with the United States. Now we have to reach out to more countries in the free world, and as a consequence of this World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet that was organized on 22nd and 23rd of last month, many members of parliament have now become more engaged, and they were really they were sitting with Richard Gere in the evening and talking about what needs to be done, how it can be done. So we are looking at more proactive participation from other members of parliament in other countries to take similar lines. So at this World Parliamentarians Convention, we did not take up any issues that concerns Tibet or what's happening inside Tibet, because those are all in the background notes. And most of the members of parliament who come for these conventions already know about these issues. Yeah. So what we tried to focus during these 2 days convention was as to how we can move forward. So the one topic was like-minded countries. So with US leading, how do we do this? How do we get this done between the foreign offices of different nations and parliamentarians from different nations, how each one can encourage each other, how each one can support each other on resolving the Sino-Tibet conflict, particularly to start with, to bring China on the negotiating table. So let's see how this strategy moves forward, and then we can revisit, review, and see how best to think about this in the future. There's 2 more hands there, several hands. Okay. The Tangbo, Mike, okay.
I apologize beforehand if my voice trembles. I'm pretty nervous. First of all, I'd like to thank you for all that you have done and you have been doing, and particularly on behalf of my 87-year-old father back in home in Ladakh, whose body may have weakened with the age, but his hope for Tibet still remains strong. And my question is, as you have mentioned about the milestones, you have mentioned about all those acts that have become the US official policy, which really is a milestone. Many a times in the diaspora community, when we hear the news about such an act being passed and becoming law, we are really happy about it. We do rejoice, but many times I think we miss the amount of effort that is being put up, behind the curtains by so many people, including organizations like ICT, to make this happen. So over the past years, there has been growing concern about China's transnational aggression or influence in many countries. So my question is, when you advocate for Tibet, be it ICT or other people, when you advocate for Tibet in the US political arena, what sort of challenges are you faced with, whether it's related with China's influence or any other sort of challenges that you might want to share?
Yeah, that's a good question. None of this happens easily, and it doesn't happen quickly. So this is now, almost 40 years, 35 years of work at ICT in Washington over every administration. And we don't focus only on Democrats or only on Republicans. We talk to everyone. So no matter who's in power, we still have an open ear and an open heart to our situation. It's easiest, I think, to talk about the present in terms of China. Everyone is skeptical of China. Everyone says, even with the problem with Russia right now, in the US Congress and the US administration, China is the biggest problem. And they see that going into the next decade and the decade after that. It's China that is going to be the biggest problem, and is right now. It's not Russia. So we are not in a situation where there's such economic gain that's coming from China that no one wants to hear about Tibet. I think that's evened out a bit now, and people realize that in the end, the Chinese are the ones who have benefited from the relationship with them economically. So I must say, there's not been an office. There's one office that I went to, and it was a California congressman, and they particularly had a lot of economic back and forth with the Chinese. And it was difficult, the meeting that we had with him. There was one guy in the last almost 30 years that I've been involved with ICT. Officers are really looking for a solution to the China problem right now. And of course, I see that Tibet is an important part of that, And there's a way of thinking. Look, the Uyghurs are a part of that. The Tibetans are an important part of that. The Mongolians are an important part of that. The Nepalese are an important part of that. The Indians are an important part of that. All of Asia, and Southeast Asia is also looking at their world and going, we're going to get swamped by the Chinese, and we'd like to have a way out. So everyone is looking for other relationships other than being stuck with a relationship with the Chinese who they do not trust. They see as completely authoritarian. They're not blind to what's been happening in Hong Kong and in Tibet and in Xinjiang and elsewhere. So it's actually a moment where we want to go into those offices and talk about China. I don't know the same in Europe, because I haven't been working in Europe as much. Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, Europe is a little more difficult, at least now when we go and lobby, when we go and advocate for Tibet, we have to understand the political situation of that country and the political system of that country.
And each one is different.
One is different.
But that feeling of being insecure in a Chinese world and where China is going and how effective that they have been in all continents and using different strategies, everyone is aware of that now.
And Europe is a little more challenging in the sense that since the formation of the European Union, you need consensus of all the 27 different nations under it. So when you talk about foreign policy or trade policy, it's very difficult to gain consensus in the European Union because there are always one or two other countries who says, okay, this is not the right way to go, then it gets stuck. But on national levels, you can do different things at the union level, European Union level, at the parliament level, council level. There may be things we can do in a different way. Right now, what we need to focus is who are the people who design these policies. So we are talking about this troika of the presidency that precedes the incumbent presidency and the upcoming presidency. Right now, we are talking about France, Czech Republic, who has just taken over, and the next coming up presidency is Sweden. So we have to focus on these three countries first. Then after 6 months, then you have to focus on Spain, who's going to take over the presidency. So all these, we have to now start working with a very focused mind and how, which area, which person, or which institution is the right person to do it. So we need very focused advocacy. We have very limited resources, both human and financial. So we need to now know exactly how to get things done in a better way, in a better focused way. Because of, for which we have made some structural changes, it's not very visible right now, but maybe in the few months to come, those will be more visible. But in Europe, it's definitely more difficult. But in the United States, as Richard has said, we have, because of His Holiness, we have always enjoyed bicameral, bipartisan support in the United States. And we know how the United States Congress functions, and we know exactly whom to reach out, and there is a lot of sympathy and support. When a bill is moved, right now, of course, there are issues about who takes the credit, who moves the bill, and depending on their own political position, also they have to make changes to the bills, reconcile the wordings. Some bills has to go through judiciary. Again, you have to reach out to the judiciary committee. So there are so many levels during a process of a bill being passed, and even the 2002 Act was moved sometime in 2000. So sometimes it takes about 1.5 years, sometimes it takes about 2 years to get a bill into an act. Even with the RATA, I remember it was being moved even before I became the representative. And the RATA got approved only after I left the office. So it takes that long. So we have to work continuously with the Congress, with the staffers, with the members. And the International Campaign for Tibet has played a very, very important role. It's not just an institution that is there. It's one of the strongest Tibet advocacy group now among the Tibet supporters because of some of the structural finesse they have in terms of having membership in different countries that enables them to survive. It's not just one-time grant which you use it and then it's over. So they have a very good structure there, and to work with the Congress, it's not just the member of the Congress, it's the staffers of the Congress. So now
this is a very important point,
Yeah.
Sikyo is saying right now.
So we have to reach out to staffers as much as possible. ICT has played very important roles in bringing staffers to Dharamsala. And once they are here, once they have an audience with His Holiness, you know what happens. There's a huge transformation. There's much more commitment. It's very easy to reach out to them. So through the WeTag program that we have launched last year, which also needs to take off in a grand way, is also to reach out to members of Congress at the grassroots level, at their local level, so that Tibetans have access to all these legislators whenever they need to. So if we can do that in so many different countries where we have Tibetans who have become nationals in those countries, speak the language, understand the system, then we feel that with this more focused and renewed energy, this will have consequential things for not just the Tibetan as a movement, but in terms of its effect on the national governments and the unions, wherever that comes from.
Just Richard Gere, just
Tashi
taking
le.
the second job. I'm also quite nervous, but I think I will know.
Why is everybody nervous? Only when they see Richard Gere, they get nervous.
I just don't want to lose the opportunity to ask a question to a great actor and a long-time supporter of our cause. And also, I had the honor to invite Richard Gere to lots of TSG conferences. I'm always at the backstage, but today I just want to ask a question face-to-face to you. So Richard Gere rightly said when you make the opening remarks that your tragedy is a joy to the rest of the world. It makes me more prouder at being a Tibetan. Thank you, Richard Gere. And my question is, with the overgrowing power of China and the hegemony of China all over the world, what future do you see for the cause of Tibet? And what do you advise, how and what should we do to galvanize the cause of Tibet? Thank you.
Those are simple, small questions you asked there. When I spoke to His Holiness yesterday morning, one thing that struck me is that he said several times, things are going to change in China. And I don't doubt that, because it's a pressure cooker right now. And even, I'm hearing from several different sources that this lockdown for COVID is not just for COVID. It's an opportunity for Xi Jinping to remove any enemies or people who might be not willing to share power or give power to him, any rivals. The way that they're functioning, of course, is successful in many ways because it's a top-down approach with complete authority. But ultimately, it's not going to work because you're denying the human element of society. And eventually, this is going to have to explode. It always has. There's not one dictatorship that's lasted more than a few decades. Eventually, it explodes. And I think that's what His Holiness was saying, and I've heard this from other people who are close to the situation. You don't know when. Unfortunately, they had a 100-year plan, and they're probably 50 years ahead of that plan already, because they're one-pointed. They don't change administrations. It's one idea, one plan. They take advantage of weaknesses in every culture, every country, every continent. But ultimately, it creates a lot of problems, and those problems do boomerang back to China. So it may well be that there is a huge change within China, and Tibet can take advantage of that and should be a recipient of that change. Look, I personally don't see that there's a reason why Tibet can't exist within some kind of a federation of China. It seems logical and it seems practical and rational. But at the same time, this extraordinary tragedy and destruction of the Tibetan mind and heart is something that we can't tolerate. And we have to keep talking about. But we have to also tie this to other movements. We tie it to Ukraine. We tie it to the Uyghurs. We tie it to the Taiwanese and the Hong Kongers, to every culture that is being decimated by an authoritarian government. Going back to, again, what the major issue is, and I've said this over and over again, no one would die for the Communist Party. No one loves the Communist Party. You need it within that culture, but you wouldn't die for it. Tibetans love His Holiness. They would die for His Holiness. And that will always make them feel insecure, the Chinese. Their power base is based on economic gain and a sense of security of the people. If that sense of security is diminished and economic security is diminished, and we're seeing now health care security is diminished. You know, the real problems, human problems, are going to come to the surface again. I think we have to, I'm circling back to what I said in the beginning. You are the best ambassadors of the Tibetan movement, each one of you, in every interaction, to be the best Tibetan you can possibly be. And in the most generous terms, and deep understanding terms, and compassionate terms, talk about what has happened to Tibet and is happening right now. That has waves in the real world that resonate. And we've been doing that in America for many decades now. And that's why we've been as successful as we have. And I mean, obviously we have real powerful supporters like Nancy Pelosi and Jim McGovern now, who emerged like 10 years ago as a huge supporter of Tibet, and powerful and brave, with great courage to still keep talking about Tibet. I remember being in having meetings with Speaker Pelosi when the healthcare issue was going on in the US. Huge headache of a problem. She stopped everything and had a 1-hour meeting with us just on Tibet, completely focused on Tibet. The other day, I mean, they're having huge problems she's dealing with. She came and spent an hour with us.
In April, she spent 1.5 hours with us, and this time in June at the inaugural session, she spent an hour again.
Focused.
Yeah.
Not taking any other phone calls, hand-picking congressmen and senators to deal with, so that this was really moving forward. Now, that's rare. It doesn't happen anyplace on the planet. It can, but that happened with a lot of work. A lot of work from my side, from the offices of Tibet, ICT in general. We brought our highest skill level to the game. And we have to keep learning how to do it better and better all the time. But you make little wins, little successes, and you move forward. Little successes, you move forward. This making connections with staffers, everything happens through staffers. If the staffer is interested in it, let me tell you how many of these things happen, is that I'm able to come in at the top level. I can talk to the senator and the congressman and the ambassador, and I can get in there. I don't have the time and energy to follow up. The follow-up is with staffers. So our staffers at ICT and the staffers at the congressman's office or congresswoman's office, they have to hit it off on a personal level and trust each other.
Yes.
And when that relationship flowers, it blossoms, then we can all work together and do extraordinary things. Sometimes it's little ways, sometimes it's big ways. Sometimes the Tibet Policy Act, you know, which we keep updating and add more important parts to. But we have to keep moving. We have to be active. And we have to be the most genuine we possibly can be. And we have to believe in nonviolence, not as a tactic, but as a way of life. And that every interaction is really coming from that very pure place that His Holiness would be proud of. Thanks.
Voilà. 가진 주디고요. 대수 된 대수. 신앙사도 보시고 He's hiding behind the curtains with the mic.
Good afternoon, Honorable Sego and Richard Gere.
Thank you.
My question, I come from Department of Education. Right now, I work here in the Department of Education. So my question to you is, Tibetan children in India have access to learning their mother tongue in school. So I just want to know whether, we know that Tibetans in America, American Tibetan children, don't have access to learning Tibetan language in school. And in order to learn the language, they have to use their weekend. So we have weekend Tibetan language classes. So is there any possibility with the help, with advocacy or with talking to the parliamentarians or lawmakers in making this possible for Tibetan children in the schools where they visit, having Tibetan language as one of the options?
I think that, yeah, I think that's a beautiful idea and completely idealistic and probably almost totally impossible. But I think it's up to, I don't think you can expect governments to do that, Western governments to do that. But I think the Tibetan communities can do that. You know, if the extreme of that would be, yeah, you create Tibetan language schools in Toronto and Zurich and New York. I mean, that's possible, but I don't think in America it's practical to have Tibetan language. Now, maybe in Queens, which has so many Tibetans, maybe that can be in certain schools, if it's primarily Tibetans living in that school district, it might be possible to do that. I never thought about that before, but maybe that would be possible.
My second question is, our democracy that is gifted by His Holiness is partyless parliamentary democratic setup, which is very unique, and we do not have a role model. And we have other democracies. So I personally feel that we have not invested enough time to understand our partyless parliamentary democracy. And and I feel that if we invest and if we work on this, as His Holiness always says that when it comes to Buddhism, we can be the 21st century Buddhists and be a leader there. And I strongly feel that we can be leader in politics also, in this kind of parliamentary democratic setup. And so my question is, yes, because at this point I feel that when we have not invested and understood this well, and that's why many times we tend to follow the models that exist, which is very, very different.
Yeah.
So here also I feel that we can, as His Holiness envisions and hopes and aspires from the Tibetans, that we can be leader here also.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this regard, is there any, I mean, not, I won't say advice, but is there any, your opinion and your suggestions to the Tibetans that is there a hope that we can be a leader in this if we really fully invest in it?
Yeah, before Richard
question.
takes the second question, just to touch upon your first question, during my last visit to Minnesota this last month, this is not the first time, but in concrete terms, we are talking about starting charter schools. So the possibilities, there are so many questions still, whether a charter school has to be restricted within the district, in a state, or there could be students coming from other states to join the charter school in another state, or can there be students coming from other districts within the state also to come or not? So there are so many other questions which we need to first find answers for. Then we'll be talking with the parents, because without children, schools doesn't make sense. Initially, parents will say, you need this, you need that, but once a school is set up, if there are no children, then it doesn't make sense. So we have to take it step by step and see how it can be done. You want to take the second question on democracy? And
Yeah, look, democracy is a messy business, for sure. And you do have a unique situation here. My own, look, obviously you have your problems here. And I don't know that you have arrived at the best version of democracy yet. But I don't think you have to yet. I think you're inventing something. And I don't think that your first idea has to be your best idea. I think you evolve. I think this is perfectly fine. I wouldn't personally have a problem if in the next few years you kind of look at the democracy that you had accepted here, that's in your constitution, and go, I think we've learned something in the meantime. Maybe we want to change this a little bit. We have better ideas now. The American Revolution, creating our democracy, was not intended to last for thousands of years. It was intended, Thomas Jefferson, who was one of our great thinkers when our democracy was established, said this revolution is perpetual. We should always be working on it. And you have unique elements here that I don't think any other country has, that somehow you've got to find a way to make it work. Not to jettison everything you had in Old Tibet, but maybe bring some of those elements into democracy in a unique and creative way.
Thank you so much, Richard. I remember at one time people saying that when you have film stars to support the Tibetan cause, it's like a fashion. It wanes in a short period. But with Richard, it has never been the case. And right now, he again recommitted himself to work for the cause of Tibet till the time that we are back in Tibet, and he has taken a new step during this visit by bringing his son, Homer, to introduce the Tibetan community to his son, who can eventually take over from him, hopefully.
He's so overwhelmed. Everybody says that to him. And he goes, I can't carry that weight. My God. He's so upset. So please don't say to him that he's going to take over.
So let's not burden him anymore. At least let him get to know Dharamsala. He's already started meeting people, so he's having a great time in the last 1 week that he's with his father here. So thank you very much, Richard. We have a lot of respect and a lot of appreciation for all the things that you have been doing and you are doing and what you will be doing for Tibet. I personally look forward as Sikyong to work with you more in the coming years. And let's have a round of applause for Richard.
Thank you. Tujiche. Tujiche.